Just after 2 in the morning on July the 30th, 1916, a series of explosions tears through a munitions depot on the New Jersey shoreline, so violent that windows shatter across Manhattan and the blast is felt as far away as Philadelphia. German saboteurs have just detonated tons of munitions bound for the Allied war effort in Europe, and less than a mile across the water, a 150-foot statue takes the shockwave directly in her raised right arm. She survives. But more than a century later, visitors still can't climb up into her torch, and the reason traces directly back to that night. Stick around, because understanding how a gift meant to celebrate friendship between two nations nearly stalled twice for lack of money on both sides of the Atlantic, then ended up scarred by a foreign attack and rebuilt from the inside out, means understanding one of the most surprising construction stories in American history. The idea began, as these things often do, with an argument about what democracy was actually worth. In the years after the American Civil War, French historian and abolitionist Édouard de La Boulaye began promoting a monument that would do three things at once: mark the upcoming 100th anniversary of American independence, celebrate the survival of American democracy through civil war, and honor the recent abolition of slavery in the United States. La Boulaye, living under the authoritarian rule of Napoleon III, hoped that praising liberty abroad might quietly encourage the French to demand more of it at home. The sculptor who would eventually bring the idea to life, Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, had actually tried something remarkably similar once already, and it had nothing to do with America at all. Years earlier, Bartholdi had proposed an enormous lighthouse for the northern entrance of the Suez Canal in Egypt. A robed peasant woman holding a torch aloft, meant to guide ships into the canal at night. Egypt's ruler and the canal's own developer rejected it as too expensive, and the idea went nowhere. When Bartholdi turned his attention to America a few years later, clear elements of that abandoned Egyptian concept carried over into his new design: the robe, the raised torch, now reimagined as the Roman goddess of liberty instead of an Egyptian peasant. It wasn't even a new type of monument in spirit. Bartholdi was deliberately working in the tradition of colossal monuments stretching back to antiquity, like the ancient Colossus of Rhodes, a giant bronze statue of the sun god Helios that once stood on that Greek island. Bartholdi was, whether he fully admitted it or not, building the 19th century's answer to an ancient wonder. By 1875, with France's economy recovering, La Boulaye announced the project publicly and gave it a name: Liberty Enlightening the World. The arrangement was straightforward on paper. France would pay for the statue, and the United States would provide the site and pay for its pedestal. In practice, funding both halves would prove to be a genuine ordeal. Bartholdi and La Boulaye were careful about what the statue would and wouldn't represent. Rather than the bare-chested, musket-wielding liberty of French revolutionary art, they wanted something peaceful, a fully robed woman carrying a torch instead of a weapon. At her feet, mostly hidden beneath her robes and easy to miss from the ground, she steps over a broken shackle and chain, a quiet nod to the end of slavery. In her left hand, she holds a tablet inscribed with the date of the Declaration of Independence in Roman numerals. Bartholdi considered giving her the soft liberty cap that traditionally marked a freed Roman slave, but rejected it as too closely tied to France's own revolutionary symbol, choosing a crown of radiating spikes instead, which is popularly said to represent the 7 seas and 7 continents. Though historians have never been able to confirm, that was Bartholdi's actual intent. A popular story holds that her face was modeled on Bartholdi's own mother. The museum that holds his archives has stated there's no real evidence for that claim either. To drum up support before the design was even finished, Bartholdi built the torch-bearing arm first and shipped it to Philadelphia for the 1876 Centennial Exposition, America's first official World's Fair, where visitors paid a small fee to climb a ladder up to the torch's balcony. The arm then spent several years on public display in New York's Madison Square Park until 1882, before finally rejoining the rest of the statue back in France. The head went on similar public display at the 1878 Paris World's Fair. Back home, the French government even authorized a public lottery to help fund construction, and tickets were sold just to tour the workshop where the statue was being built. The statue's actual engineering went through a dramatic change partway through construction. Bartholdi's original structural engineer, the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, famous for restoring Notre Dame, planned to build heavy, sand-filled masonry compartments inside the statue, using their sheer mass to anchor the copper skin above. When Viollet-le-Duc died suddenly in 1879, he left no clear plan for how his masonry design was supposed to connect to the copper shell higher up. Bartholdi turned instead to a rising engineer named Gustave Eiffel, who scrapped the masonry idea completely and designed something far more radical: a radically lightweight central iron pylon paired with a flexible secondary framework wrapped around it. Rather than lock the copper rigidly to that frame, Eiffel let it float slightly on flexible connections so the whole statue could shift with the wind and expand with summer heat without cracking. In a strong gust off the harbor, the statue's body can still sway up to about 3 inches, with the torch itself moving roughly 5. It's one of the earliest large-scale examples of what engineers now call curtain wall construction, a building's skin hanging off an interior frame rather than bearing weight itself, a principle that would later become fundamental to modern curtain wall skyscrapers. While France scraped together funds for the statue itself, raising the money for its American pedestal turned into a genuine crisis. An economic depression through much of the 1870s didn't help, and plenty of Americans openly resented being asked to pay for a French sculptor's allegorical woman when the gift itself was supposedly free. Newspapers mocked the fundraising effort outright. At one especially low point, the New York committee had just $3,000 left in the bank and had to halt construction entirely, while other American cities circled like vultures, offering to fund the whole pedestal themselves if the statue would simply be relocated to their harbor instead. It took newspaper publisher Joseph Pulitzer to save the project. In 1885, Pulitzer launched a public campaign in his paper, The World, promising to print the name of absolutely everyone who donated, no matter how small the amount. It worked spectacularly. A young girl mailed in 60 cents she'd saved through what she called self-denial. An office boy sent 5 cents. A group of children donated $1 they'd been saving for the circus. Within about 6 months, more than 120,000 donors had given over $100,000, roughly 80% of it in gifts of less than a single dollar. Construction on the pedestal resumed almost immediately. The pedestal itself, designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt, was originally conceived as a considerably taller and more elaborate structure, but funding problems forced him to scale it back to a shorter, roughly 90-foot design, built from poured concrete and faced with granite blocks. The resulting pour, with walls up to 20 feet thick in places, was the largest single mass of concrete poured anywhere up to that point in history, built inside the star-shaped walls of a disused army fort that Bartholdi himself had scouted as the ideal site back in 1871. The completed statue was formally presented to the American ambassador in Paris on July 4, 1884, fittingly enough. It was then taken apart into roughly 350 individual pieces, packed into 214 crates, and shipped across the Atlantic aboard a French naval vessel, arriving in New York Harbor in June of 1885 to a welcome of 200,000 people lining the docks, months before the pedestal beneath her was even finished. Reassembly didn't begin until the following spring, and remarkably, the entire 151-foot copper statue went back together without any conventional scaffolding at all, with steam-driven cranes and derricks lifting each section into place instead. Even the statue's famous torch got off to a disappointing start. Bartholdi originally wanted floodlights mounted on the torch balcony, but the Army Corps of Engineers vetoed the idea just a week before the dedication, worried it would blind ship pilots navigating the harbor at night. Instead, workers cut small portholes into the copper torch and placed lights inside, producing a glow so faint that one newspaper compared it to a glowworm rather than a beacon. The statue was administered for years afterward by the United States Lighthouse Board, since its illuminated torch officially counted as a maritime navigation aid, though it never worked especially well in that role and was eventually handed off to the War Department instead. The dedication itself, on October the 28th, 1886, drew a New York parade so large that stockbrokers began throwing ticker tape from their office windows as it passed, unintentionally inventing the New York ticker tape parade on the spot. President Grover Cleveland presided over the ceremony, an odd twist given that as governor of New York 2 years earlier, he'd personally vetoed state funding for the very same project. At the unveiling, Bartholdi mistook a pause in one senator's speech for its ending and let the covering flag drop early, cutting the address short to cheering crowds. No ordinary members of the public were allowed onto the island that day, a restriction that infuriated a group of suffragists who chartered their own boat, sailed as close as they could, and pointedly noted the irony of celebrating liberty as a woman while women in America still couldn't vote. The poem now most associated with the statue wasn't even part of the original ceremony. Poet Emma Lazarus wrote her sonnet, The New Colossus, in 1883 for an art auction meant to help fund the Pedestal, drawing on her own work at the time helping Jewish refugees who had fled violent pogroms in Eastern Europe. Her poem contrasted the statue with the ancient Colossus of Rhodes, recasting liberty not as a conquering giant, but as a welcoming mother of exiles. At the time, almost nobody noticed it. The plaque bearing her words wasn't even added to the statue's pedestal until 1903, 17 years after the dedication, and it was really the statue's proximity to the immigration station on nearby Ellis Island that eventually cemented her words as the monument's defining message. Over the following decades, the statue's shiny reddish-brown copper slowly transformed, oxidizing into the green patina everyone recognizes today. Congress, mistakenly assuming the color change signaled corrosion, actually authorized funds to paint the exterior. Public outcry was so fierce, and Army engineers confirmed the patina was actually protecting the copper underneath, that only the interior ever got painted. Then came the night that changed the statue permanently. In the early hours of July 30th, 1916, German agents detonated a massive stockpile of munitions at Black Tom, a shipping depot on the New Jersey shore barely a mile from Liberty Island, in an effort to disrupt weapons shipments bound for the Allied war effort in Europe. Windows shattered across Manhattan, and shrapnel tore into the statue's torch-bearing arm. The narrow ascent up into the torch, damaged and never fully trusted again, was closed to the public for safety and has remained closed ever since. When America entered the war the following year, the statue's image became a fixture of recruitment posters and Liberty Bond campaigns, a reminder that the nation fighting for liberty abroad had once received her as a literal gift. That same year, publisher Ralph Pulitzer raised money for a proper exterior lighting system. The torch itself was redesigned around this time by Gutzon Borglum, who would later go on to carve Mount Rushmore. During the Second World War, the torch went dark under wartime blackout rules, although the monument itself remained open to visitors, except for one deliberate exception. On D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, the statue's lights flashed ... Morse code for the letter 5, victory, out across the harbor. By the 1980s, decades of exposure had taken a serious toll. Engineers preparing for the statue's centennial found extensive corrosion in the iron armature system, damage to the copper skin, and serious deterioration in the torch. A restoration commission led by auto executive Lee Iacocca led a massive private fundraising campaign for the restoration of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, in part through one of the earliest corporate cause marketing campaigns ever attempted, a credit card company that donated a penny to the restoration for every purchase made with its card. Workers had to don sealed protective suits with their own air supply just to remove the century-old asbestos insulation Eiffel had originally installed to prevent corrosion between the copper and iron. The badly corroded iron armature bars connecting the copper skin to Eiffel's framework were replaced with stainless steel, and the torch was rebuilt once more, this time finished in gleaming 24-karat gold leaf, the version that still shines above New York Harbor today. The statue has weathered plenty since. Its interior remained restricted for years after the September 11th attacks, with the crown finally reopening in 2009. Liberty Island closed again after Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and did not reopen until July of the following year. In 2019, an entirely new museum opened, so every visitor, not just the small fraction who could once squeeze into the pedestal, could finally see the original torch and learn the statue's full story up close. Millions of people visit every year. So here's a question worth sitting with. This was a monument almost undone twice by money trouble on two different continents, saved largely by small donations from ordinary schoolchildren, office boys, and strangers rather than the wealthy, and permanently scarred by a wartime attack most Americans have never even heard of. Does knowing how close Liberty came to never being finished at all change how you see her the next time you spot that torch across the harbor? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this look behind one of the world's most recognizable statues gave you a new appreciation for what it actually took to build her, give this video a like, subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest feats of engineering, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.